Hello and welcome to the Color Mentor podcast. My name is Paul Hanrahan. I'm a colorist, originally from South Africa. Now I'm based in Taiwan. On this podcast, I'm going to be talking to people who have mentored and inspired me on my color grading journey over the years. So welcome to the show. If you'd like to learn more about color grading, you can head over to my Patreon. It's called Color Mentor at patreon.com, and it includes test footage, color charts, basic skill training, all the way up to full coursework on various topics. I also offer one-on-one mentoring for those who want to refine their craft further. But without further ado, let's get on with the show. Those of you listening to the audio podcast version of this episode, I would strongly encourage you to move over to the YouTube version if possible, because then you can see the visual overlays as they're being explained. But if you are going to listen to the audio version, totally fine. Just remember to download all the examples and power grades so that you can check them out later when you have time. Hi there. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Troy Sobotka. Some of you may know him from either 3D world or the live action world, as he's developed the AGX output transform. And if you've ever chatted to him, you'll know that his interest is visual cognition. And what is visual cognition? Over the past few weeks, we've been talking intensively about it and how it affects what we do in the film and essentially photography, any of the creative arts, the way we render to displays. There are 2 episodes here. There's too much material to cram into one, but I wanted to start off with some visual examples just to show roughly what we're talking about. So this whole episode, 2 episodes, is going to be going beyond the realm of just strict formalized color science or creative film emulation or the sandpit that we normally play in as film professionals. And it's taking an additional step back to say that the process of visual cognition that takes place inside our eyes and our brains is partially understood, not completely understood, and that the assumptions that all of our color management and image science is based on, over time we will find increasingly it's not enough. It's not good enough. And I'm going to show you right now some visual examples of how the reality of stimuli and color science and what color is coming out of the monitor versus what you're seeing. There's some very real situations where it can be very different. So let's look at some of those examples. Part of what we discuss in this episode is a critique of current day colorimetry and how it gets applied into the film and television industry. Maybe Troy would have a different opinion, but this isn't designed to be an attack on the hard work that's being done on the ACEs, community forums, and generally color science and film emulation and all these things in general. It's just an encouragement to say, let's throw the net wider and look more at all the factors, and especially the biological factors and the way that humans sense images. So first, to tell you what this episode is not. It's not about these kind of images where, these images that I took on a phone, on a fast-moving train, out the window of the sun, and it's clear that there's breakup here around the sun. It looks like the hole's been cut in the sky and it's glued. It's like almost like a background painting that's got a hole in it and there's a light shining through it. We're not specifically talking about these kind of things, these technical errors, but obviously these would be considered cognition errors. They break our sense of immersion or belief in that the picture is real. We feel like it's 2 things comped together. We feel something stuck on another thing, or a hole in the image. This neon blue, which has come to be known synonymous with early versions of ACEs. We're not specifically talking about that. We're more talking about the cognitive result of blues, which are somehow breaking through and being way too dense. Typical things are bright lights and things like that. So it's not specifically a critique on these things, because these things are well documented. It's more a step back to say a broader look at why can't our color management systems deal with these comfortably? We compare to chemical film and use that as, because it's over 100 years and the basis of our photographic and hence movie tradition. So there's a lot of weight on that, but obviously we're moving on to bigger and better things. So we do take it as a reference point. These examples I will include in a downloadable Dropbox. I'll put together some power grades where you can try these out. So basically what I have here is on input, I've got a gray background. I've graded it to be, you can see on the vector scope, you can see that it's been reduced to a kind of a lower range. And I've put two circular windows. These circular windows have a solid color, a solid gray color. And you can see on the scopes that these two gray colors are the same value. So we could say they are the same stimuli coming out of the screen to your eyes. I have the ability to, through this match node, to adjust the right-hand one. And now I'm tasking myself, and I'm tasking you as well, to go and try this example. You don't necessarily need the scopes up here, but I'm showing you, leaving them up, you can see the implications. Comparison between stimuli versus what you actually, the cognitive result. I can see that the two values are the same on the parade scope, but the right-hand one looks darker. And that's because of the way it's placed on this gradient background. I'd encourage you to try this exercise. Going darker is obviously wrong. Lighter, you might feel, okay, a little bit lighter, and there might be times where you feel part of the one circle matches, or all of it, but then you realize, like for example there, what if I orientate the right-hand one in the same relative position to the gradient? Will that make these two feel like they're the same? And you look at it for a while and you start realizing, no, for some reason this right-hand edge here, that's looking brighter than this left-hand edge. And I encourage you to try this exercise, and just realize that matching stimuli, matching exact RGB values, put these corrections at 77, red, green, and blue on the left, 77, red, green, and blue on the right, but it looks different. So these are the kind of visual cognition examples where there's a disconnect between the numbers of what's going on inside the system and what you're seeing. Another example, if we're saying that the gradient is a trick, so it's not good enough. So now we'll do an example without, it's just two flat fields. So again, the middles are the same stimuli, both 77, red, green, and blue. They've been placed on different brightness backgrounds. And now we can try and use offset to get them to visually match. So going darker, not correct. Right is still too dark, so I need to lift up, lift up, lift up. And then somewhere here where it's almost the same as its background, well, let's say I put it the same as its background. And then if I compare here, this background point to there, I feel, no, it's definitely too bright. So I've got to come back down a bit. Come back down a bit. You know, I mean, this is the day-to-day of being a colorist, right? But as soon as I do that, as soon as I puncture down into the surface, this looks darker than this to me. So try this at home, check it out, and you can see that these are very real things, and they're not tricks, they're not illusions. This is the way that your visual cognition, your eyes and brain work. And it's repeatable again and again and again and again. It's not an effect that wears off. And it's totally related to what is next to this gray patch, or what environment it sits in, and our perception varies drastically. A visual example here to say that these three gray patches and these three are all the same, the same values. But if they're placed on a dark background, they appear one way. A lighter background and a very light background, we perceive them very differently. Also, the territory that we're going into here is, I would like you to just think about it for a moment. There's a gentle gradient, a light gray circle and a dark gray circle, but your brain would probably say, there's a light source off to the right-hand side, there's a ball that is blocking the light source and hence throwing a shadow. Now, that's amazing. That is totally amazing that we can start isolating shapes and doing cognition on very simple geometries. This is the fascinating part. So You can see in each one of these cases, there's a difference between the circle and its background. And so in this case, all three are brighter than their background. Here, only this right-hand one is brighter, so it's got like an up energy relative to the ground. These ones are down. And in this case, they're all down. The ground is brighter. So, you can ask yourself, which is the brightest white patch? And to my eye, it's this one here. But this, and even this here is actually brighter. If I measure it, this is around about 218. This is up towards 234. This is also 218. But sure as shit, this one looks the brightest because of its relative situation. This is known as a staircase Gelb. This has to be viewed in a very dark environment, but I'll show it to you anyway, and I'll give you the frames and you can try it out yourself. You'll see the first, which is actually mid-gray. It's 50% gray. You can see it on the scopes here, and that'll feel very bright. I don't want to tell you too much. I'd rather you just experience this for yourself. And you can see that as you step through each additional frame, we get brighter and brighter by same increments. Now, the increments are important in this experiment. This is Gilchrest's staircase experiment, and we will talk more about this. But try this in a very dark environment, and you'll see the range of what you think is white, what you think peak white is at each stage is very plastic and very dynamic. This is a similar example being demonstrated by a Japanese professor of psychophysics and visual cognition called Akiyoshi. His example of this is basically he takes this gray ramp, 100% to 0. You can see it on the scopes there. He takes a portion of it. So we're going to cut out this portion and I'm going to move it to the right. So it'll be on this background. So at this point, ask yourself, what is the brightest part of the image? And we'd obviously say this left-hand edge here, that's 100% white. So then we take a square and we slide it to the right. And now ask yourself again, what is the brightest part of the image? May still be a bit of a competition, either here or here. Because you can see that we've taken the same slope and we've pasted it across there. Just same piece, same brightness, just moved in position to the right. The exercise goes on, taking increasing position change, but it's the same brightness patch. It's also a gradient. You'll see that as it moves into a darker and darker environment, it will appear to be brighter and brighter. It's the same patch. It's the same as this piece here that has been copied across, but now this will definitely look like the brightest. The same exercise can be done working up from the darkest area. So we have the darkest 10% of the image, a square, and we move it across. And at each stage, when you try this on your own, in your own suite, on your own monitor, and you put up each of these progressively, just keep asking yourself, which is the darkest part of the image? And as all the final one comes in, it's the same value. You can see on the vector scope, it's the same level of black from 0 up to this 10% or whatever it is. But for some reason, I get two effects on this. For me, this slope from here to here looks very shallow. Looks from very dark black, only up a little bit. Whereas here looks also it's pretty dark, but it looks like it comes up way more. And here looks like it comes up the most. So I get a kind of compression where this gradient now looks less because it's against a very white background. And also the direction of the gradient. So yeah, try these. See what you see. This next one is quite interesting. It's basically just taking a flat gray field and then using various power windows and shapes and color corrections, brightness changes, changes of color to essentially build a geometric shape where there was none and without any source footage. Our only source footage is this gray background. So if I just draw a circle, it's a power window, grade a color into it. So that is our basis for our colored shape that we're going to be drawing. I'm going to add to it a key light. So it's basically just lightening, an offset or gain change in that area. And then now you can see that just from something that was totally flat, we now start getting an idea of directionality. And I'll just quickly step through these and you can see how the additional shadow, starting to put in a relationship to the floor. And these are all just step-by-step kind of tweaks. I want the highlight to feel like it's brightening on the floor a little more. And it's just this matte being fed to all these different layers. I put a gradient on the background, just slightly darkening a little more, darkening the edges, darkening the floor in the front, putting a bit of blue spill into this area as if it's the blue ball reflecting into the shadow here. And then last of all, I take a white layer and just, draw a little shape, and as if it's now a glossy ball and reflecting. So just from this, we now make this with no actual source footage. These last few nodes are a color correction, as if this was a shot, and just, giving it some contrast, giving it some grain, doing a slight clipping on the output. So yeah, a very interesting exercise so that where there was nothing, just through changes in lightness and darkness, we can simulate 3D object and depth and an idea of what's in front of what and where the light source is and what the geometry is, just from something that's totally 2D. Interesting exercise. This one just shows a similar idea using a gradient as a background. Move on to the next one. This demonstration is on a very amazing website. It's michaelbach.de. These two circles are changing at the same rate. And you can see on the scopes that they're moving bright to dark at the exact same rate. But as the background behind them changes, you see that on the scopes, the rate is still staying exactly the same. But once the left-hand side is now submerged in this darker background, we get a timing difference. We feel like the flashing is happening at a different rate. I mean, it's fairly intuitive. Why? It's because it's relative to the background. It disappears into the background at a different stage if the background is white or black. But now it looks like they're totally in sync, pulsing in sync, and they are. The stimuli is pulsing in sync. But strangely enough, as we get to the end, we get this effect that the pulsing is now out of sync. I'd highly encourage you to go to Michael Bach's website, and he's got a plethora of these examples. Something else to look at is the context. We've spoken about already. The context is very important. So this is the same gradient in the middle. If it's against a background with lots of brightness changes, we will perceive it in a very different way to if it's on a completely flat background. And if you look carefully at this image, you'll see that close to where there's a neighboring dark, we will feel that that's brighter, and close to a bright area, we'll feel that that's darker. So we'll get these opposite reactions. So to take this idea a bit further, this is a completely, you can see on the vector scope, totally flat on a totally flat background, equal stimuli. If we change the background to be a gradient up and a gradient down, if we now compare the edge of this bar, we seem to feel like it's brighter here and darker here. But the value hasn't changed at all. The bar itself has stayed at exactly the same value. It was there, and it's still there. But we have now a perception of something going on here in the middle, just because of this background. It's a relative thing. It's a gradient. In terms of color, it's called the Abney effect. So this is actually a very technical drawing. You can say it's from the blue maximum saturation all the way into the white point. Or if you want to talk about it in the CIE chromaticity diagram, it's from the blue vertex of the 709 triangle through to the D65 white point. Only blue or white, and mixing blue and white. But if you take some time and you look at the center here, you might see another color. So just to cut to the chase, we get a pinkish magenta mauve kind of feeling going on there. So it's as if this curve goes from here to blue, sweeps a little towards magenta, and then goes towards white. Some distortion in this kind of fashion, bowing upwards. The stimuli isn't. The stimuli is not doing that at all. But if you look at this and look at it carefully, round about here, you will perceive a kind of a magenta color. So based on the few observations, with gradients, with brightness, with these color differences, what if we try and combine these effects? So again, the bar in the middle it's gray of equal stimuli. If we put it on a background with a magenta ramp, the red and the blue signals ramping up to maximum and ramping down. Same thing as the black and white version. We feel that the edges feel brighter, the middle feels darker, and depending on your eyes, each person will be slightly different. You might get a feeling of a color here in the middle. I feel slightly greenish, kind of a dull yellow or greenish kind of feeling in the presenting in the middle there. So combining these two factors, if we take a magenta ramp in the background and we take our same old blue ramp going from the blue primary into the D65 white point, now when we look at this blue, it probably feels blue all the way through. So essentially through the combination of two effects, we've adjusted our perception. The actual stimuli of that blue to white bar, has not changed at all. Just for way of comparison, if you've been staring at the screen, and we go back to this, which is a gray background, it will now look green to you from all that magenta, but after a little while, about a minute or so, the background will settle down to looking gray again, and sure enough, our magenta, pinky mauve kind of feel will come back into this middle gray zone. So this Abney effect is very interesting, and yeah, it is the way we see things. It's not an edge case illusion. It's totally prevalent all the time we're looking at things. Quite fascinating. Take a look at these chips here. So the A line and the C line are exactly the same stimuli inside the circles. The B line and the D line are exactly the same. Only difference being the background, the outside, where C and D are on a constant white background, but A and B are on steps progressively getting darker. So just as a way of example, I encourage you to look at this square here, this B6. I could imagine that still looks like a saturated orange to me, and it could be like an orange that you eat, a fruit, in a dark place, just slightly under illuminated. I would still believe that that's an orange. But now let's look at the same stimuli, exactly the same. If we look at this one here, that looks to me like the brown of a brown bear or a piece of wood or something, but they're exactly the same stimuli. If we compare this one as well, this one and this one, we feel that these keep their saturation way more, but these turn to these kind of browner, almost high contrast, more neutral colors. Quite fascinating. This one, same thing. We just compare B and D, which are the more saturated ones. Let's again look at the sixth column here, fifth and sixth. They still look like very saturated yellow patches, even though they're spheres that are now in a dark environment, but still looking very saturated. These two here look to me like just close to gray without any saturation. So I could still imagine that, I mean, just for comic sake, I did take this one step further to the ridiculous. This totally looks like an acid smiley face. This one here, I could still believe is an acid smiley face. Obviously, this is the same, but here, this looks like a gray face. These two are the same stimuli. Fascinating. As I mentioned before, the academic Akiyoshi Kitaoka, based in Japan, who studies these, I don't like to call them illusions, but yeah, these visual illusions and visual characteristics. These are quite well known. I've seen this a lot on the internet. We seem to have an idea of a yellow environment and a blue Coke can. The title is Illusory Blue. We only have yellow information. If we zoom in, at some point, as we get closer and closer and closer, and we get into the pixels, these big pixels, the blue will disappear to our eyes. And we'll realize that there's only black and white squares here and yellow and white squares there. And the vector scope confirms that. There's no blue information. As we slowly zoom out, and as the entirety of the picture comes into view, around about now, at some point here, we will start perceiving blue. Also, Akiyoshi Kitaoka's work. Up top here, we have clearly 100% white value on the face, and we have almost complete black. 111, 255, 255, 255. Now, these modified versions are very interesting. We still perceive the right-hand face as a black face, a dark face, the left hand face as a white face. It's as if the right hand, the lower right, is now in a haze. There's some smoke in the room now. It's kind of a bit hazy, but we still perceive it the same. The left hand side, it's as if the lights have been turned down or the character has stepped into a shadow. But the white face and black face are miles apart. But if we go in and we test the stimuli, we'll see that this is mid-gray and this is mid-gray. Mid-gray, mid-gray. It's just such an amazing illusion that even if you zoom in like this, even this far in, as long as you've got a little bit of these other things, you will not believe that they're the same color. This will still look brighter and this will still look darker. You have to go all the way in like this, and then you'll realize, this is mid-gray. Fascinating. Even if you do this, you put a swatch of mid-gray in between these two, it still looks to me like here is darker and here is lighter because of the surrounding things. Here you can see the picker values. It's 125, 125, everywhere, everywhere, even up here, all 125, same value. Obviously these are different, the backgrounds are different, all of this is different. Just here is all mid-gray. If I now overlay a color and just show you what's going on in those two areas, and if I put on the scopes, then yes, we confirm that it is in fact only mid-gray, but in the image, it didn't look like that. Another example is this face. We definitely say that the right-hand face is blue, the left-hand face is basically white. Here, slightly tinted to blue, slightly tinted to yellow. Here, it's almost tinted to black. If we do the same exercise, we take three equivalent areas, and we sample them only, we'll see that they're exactly the same. Another example here, not possible that these two faces are the same. It's just not possible, right? We isolate, and they're the same. 50% gray. So some mechanism in this image is making 50% gray look dark here and making it look light here. Measure it, 124, 124. It's the same value. This one, we're looking at the eyes. So if you compare this eye, this left eye looks like a bluish white. This right eye looks like a very strong blue. And here we have a yellow eye, a very yellow eye. And here we have a very dark eye, almost black, dark gray. Again, isolate, they're the same. So that's it. That's the fascinating aspects that we're going to be discussing in this episode. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we get to the interview, I feel it's important to set the stage for this topic of visual cognition, especially how it relates to image creation. I've seen people trying to tackle small pieces of this visual cognition puzzle in informal conversations on forums. I do see a lot of confusion. I see a lack of definition of terms, and the general lack of acclimatization to this topic is very apparent. So this double episode hopes to be a slightly more cohesive chunk with lots of references and examples to help orientate image makers to this interesting topic. Almost all of these examples you can try out yourself, and that's where the really important discoveries lie, the cognition of images. So if we look at the full image chain, from the scene on set to the screen and into our brains as the viewer, we would like to believe that currently it's all congruous and held together by image science, colorimetry, and other sound theories and practices. Continual technological advancements, we also might feel that more dynamic range, wider gamuts in cameras, and better displays is getting us closer to some truth about image creation. Or at very least, the image is getting better all the time, right? The ideas presented in this podcast are quite simply like a pin that pops the balloon of progress, in quotes, and makes us consider again the technical assumptions which govern image making. And most of all, challenge us to get more familiar with the strange and interesting nature of human vision. Colorimetry definitely has its uses. No one would deny that. It's just not the whole story. We can't assume that some matching experiments done 100 years ago merely need to be updated to be globally inclusive of all races and ages, and then our work is done. Far from it. To sum it up most simply, the assumption that our eyes and brain work like some kind of photometer, measuring and interpreting absolute light values in the scene, is a gross error. Our vision is not absolute. It's highly dynamic, it's contextual, it's plastic, and based on perceiving light differences in space and over time. There's also a lot of research that shows our visual cognition is more of a top-down process with brain governing eyes, as opposed to the traditional bottom-up photometer view that eyes send signals to the brain to read the world outside. Simply put, we see what we want to see and what suits our goals. Another difficult leap to take is to start dissecting the automatic visual cognition process that takes place dynamically, iteratively, every instant that we open our eyes. On this topic, Troy has some frameworks that we can use as a starting point, and these will be detailed in the second episode. The hope is that with greater understanding of this area of visual computation and visual cognition, we will cut to the chase of designing better and simpler image pipelines, which in turn will help us to feed images and stories straight into our cognitions without stumbling into clipping, gamut errors, bends and folds so easily occur now as we try to wield our bigger, better, faster tools of both image capture and display. Chemical film is often used as the reference point and was a medium that by and large achieved this goal with a fairly well-structured image pipeline. We exposed negative film in camera to light. We then processed it to leave dyes in 3 color-sensitive layers, and the ratios and densities of these 3 dye layers gave us a robust and highly creative storytelling medium. The negative was then used as an inverse kind of mold to expose the final print. This print was projected optically, attenuating bulb light by the density of the dyes in the resultant print positive image. We had a maximum dye density that blocked most of the projector light, all the way down to a minimum density which left the film mostly transparent. The process was not without its challenges, but it naturally had organic limits that filmmakers could use to beautiful effect. It didn't have no-go zones where the image suddenly fell over. Both extremes of over and underexposure still had good use in creative storytelling. The most highly saturated areas of the gamut boundary also comfortably rounded, ebbed and flowed across the image exposure range. That is not to say that shooting on film didn't have its mishaps and reshoots though, of course. With the advent of electronic and later digital cameras and displays, we have ushered in an era of recording tri-stimulus gain values on photo sites with an upper and lower range limit. We capture wider and wider ranges of gains, but the process of how these raw material gains are baked down into the final image becomes very open-ended and governed by technicians and the ideology of colorimetry. As colorists, we often get bogged down with grading versions for several different display mediums, as much as we do with the actual task of deciding how to bake down the image into its best storytelling form. Maybe it's an example of technology leading the storytelling process. This would be fine if we had a solid practice of image manipulation that easily fed into the human visual system, just as the storyteller imagined it. But more and more with these wider dynamic range displays, cameras, and dare I say post-production working formats and color management systems, we easily create broken images that bump our cognition out of immersion in the story. Although chemical film now has a revered kind of vintage status, I don't feel that a complete Luddite approach is to just abandon digital capture. I don't feel that that's what's called for. Rather just a change of metric that is more focused on the human visual system. Instead of hoping that bigger, brighter technology will somehow solve these image formation issues. Throwing in more maths and more colorimetry isn't going to solve the problem either. More maths gymnastics doesn't necessarily lead one to cleaner and simpler image pipelines. One just has to look at the latest results of working groups trying to solve these nearly unsolvable problems. This episode isn't intended to be an attack on those who work on these committees, and just an encouragement to throw the net a little wider in defining the problem, firstly, and give agency back to image creators. My belief is that the folly lies in simultaneously wanting bigger, better, brighter image gamuts and being stuck with the human audience who, time and time again, will say part of an image looks unnatural or distracting. Future stories definitely will involve invoking feelings of colors seldom perceived before, but ideally it shouldn't be at the expense of immersion. When we look at a picture, our eyes and brain engage in a cyclical hunting process to decipher shapes, areas of interest, and spatial geometry. Through this process, we cognize what is in the image. For example, which areas of the image group together as discrete objects, and which objects are in front or behind of other objects. The visual system primarily senses gradients and edges, and from there we add meaning and inference. So the tools and processes that help us form images have a large effect on how smoothly or jarringly we perceive an image to be. Bends and folds in luminance or chrominance gradients cause a dissonance in our cognition system. Also, colorists spend a lot of time fixing problems rather than painting expressively with color perceptions for the viewer. There are some aspects of this issue that relate to the heightened commodification of content creation and the need to set standards of production and make it profitable, to bolster global corporations' bottom lines, also to bolster sales of better and better cameras and technology and displays year after year. This is beyond the scope of this podcast, although we do touch on some aspects relating to market forces at play. Despite this, however, if we merely consider the fact that most colorists would say that there is an underlying technical manipulation that must be applied to get to some ground truth, scene-referred image state, this is probably the first myth that needs to be challenged. All of colorimetry, as it relates to how humans perceive light, is a cognitive interpretation. It's laden with creative and cultural assumptions, idealized skin tones, memory colors, does it look cool, that kind of thing, far outweigh any ground truth about the light that was actually recorded by the camera. Also, whether and how that gain-only light measurement of 3 discrete areas of the visual spectrum is truly enough to be molded into a scalable and naturally functional picture exposure should be up for debate and for further study. In this episode, I chat to Troy Sobotka, who is a Vancouver-based lighting, rendering, and all-around image creation person. You might know him as the designer of the AGX render transform. In this episode, you will not see Troy's face, but you will hear his voice and have access to the vast collection of reference material that he is very generous to share. In past years, he has written an online blog called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Digital Color. I would highly recommend people to read it for 2 reasons. The first 20 or so insights are the simplest and most understandable introduction to bulk standard colorimetric principles you are likely to encounter online. Also, by the end of the last few insights, you will have moved from the mindset of merely taking colorimetry as the ground truth of human visual cognition, as it is precariously balanced on some matching exercises done between the 2 world wars, and be introduced to the fascinating study of visual cognition at large. I'd highly recommend reading the whole Hitchhiker's Guide for this reason. Because of the amount of jargon that people will be unfamiliar with in the domain of visual cognition, I seriously felt the need to write The Hitchhiker's Guide to Chatting to Troy. But jokes aside, I have tried to give citations, visual examples on the YouTube version of the podcast, and ask as many questions as Troy could bear, just to try and make sense of this field of study. As a starting point, I would encourage people to reconsider the so-called illusions that are used as the test bed for visual cognition research. Most people would perceive them as clever tricks that fool our eyes, something like a a 1% small edge case or gimmick. But surprisingly, these simple images actually show us the 99% of how our visual systems behave day in and day out. Consider that as one of the first of many reframings that one has to do along this journey. I would hazard a guess to say that both the study of colorimetry and of visual cognition are scientific traditions that are more than 100 years old. One directly affects everything we do as creative image makers, and the other is mostly unknown to us, outside of a few anecdotes. I get the feeling that these ideas will meet a lot of resistance in some areas of our industry. Some might view this topic as a waste of time, and that colorimetry as it stands is perfectly functional. But I would encourage everyone to scratch a little deeper. And for example, can you give a good explanation of black, white, and the neutral axis as they pertain to how the human visual system works and how we actually see? You'll see examples of how these supposedly concrete foundations of image creation are totally plastic and alterable once within our visual cognition systems. I will include a link to some downloadable do-it-yourself visual cognition experiments that you can try out yourself. And because you are a human with eyes, you can also take part in experiencing these phenomena. In the same download will be some extra reference material and pre-interview discussions that Troy and I have had. The goal of this episode is to see how these two fields of colorimetry and visual cognition can further cross-pollinate and hopefully put more simple, useful, and expressive tools into the hands of storytellers. So let's hop on that ride.
Well, it's reactionary, it's clickbait, and or playing with you inside the maelstrom, the kind of the weather that blows online is all that kind of stuff. Like spice it up, make it sexy, and I don't know. My attitude toward teaching is, as I'm teaching you, I'm learning myself. I don't come into this saying I know everything and I've locked it down. No, every day is a surprise for me. And what being a film professional is that when you realize that it suddenly all gets pulled out from under you, is how you react then. You know what I mean? You've got this. You know where upright is. You get ruffled by something. You realize a technique you've been using for the last 20 years is kind of bullshit on some level, and then what do you do next? That's kind of the quote unquote professionalism, rather than say I've locked it down and I know what's going on.
That's essentially the fun part of the whole they're pictures, and I think we take them for granted in the way that we think we know what pictures are, and then when you actually break it down, you realize you have no clue what the hell a picture is, and it becomes a discussion as trying to figure out what you're doing in a picture. Sometimes, it's the same thing, I think, with lighting and everything else. It just becomes this sort of, what are you trying to do and how does it work? And nobody actually knows. And I think on some level that's kind of inspiring and refreshing, although it's also horrifying, I think, at times.
But is it a case where there's, it's like there's trope's the wrong word, but it's almost like, don't look behind the curtain. Like everyone knows there's a curtain and there's stuff going on, but just don't look behind the curtain and then it'll make sense. But as soon as you start looking behind the curtain, then you'll realize, oh, this is actually, it's constructed. It's not a given truth. It's not, based on some truths. It's actually based on assumptions and. It seems to be that kind of thing.
I tend to agree. I mean, I always find myself looking like, whether you're standing next to a dit card or you're trying to explain some sort of a thing in some sort of capacity to someone, I find that it's really easy for people to say, oh, this is a broken picture, for example. Like, and I'm sure you deal with this all the time, right? Especially in the electronic era, it's like, hey, this is broken. But when you actually ask people what is broken in the picture, like what are you seeing that's bad,
mm-hmm.
You'll often hear what amounts to mumbo jumbo. Like they'll say some numerical thing like, oh, this is out of gamma.
Clipping
like,
or whatever.
But that doesn't actually mean anything. That's the really interesting part, is that like if you think about the agency of our visual cognition system, we don't have the agency to see a number that's out of gamma. That's the long and the short of it.
Well, we can't discern where it is and isn't, right?
Yeah, like all we see is essentially the stimulus that's presented to us, And that's where it becomes really interesting, because I mean, for years and years, I would use the word like posterization, for example, or banding or something. But like when you actually dive into asking us what that means, you realize that you have no clue. No clue at all what it means. It's just like, okay, well, it looks, I'm seeing a step. Yeah, but what does that mean? Because at some level, it's our visual cognitions that's telling us, oh, there's a stripe in this image where there shouldn't be a stripe. Now, how do I know that there shouldn't be a stripe there? Or there's like, does that make sense? Like, it's a very
Well, I liked your Andy Warhol example. I mean, but maybe if you're going to dive into the art side of it, Andy Warhol was actually saying, "I've pulled this out of the dumpster, and now because I pulled it out, it's now art and worth something." But anyway, that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, Andy Warhol, posterized pop art, bad quality, right? No, very good quality. So yeah, where does our compass lie in that thing?
Yeah, and I think that's a really, I always pull the Warhol up, because in essence, it's really easy for you and I to say, okay, we've got a posterization problem here, but then you look at an Andy Warhol and you're like, okay, this is entirely reduced down to about 5 large, broad swaths of color, and it's not triggering the same cognitive dissonance that broad swath of color being in a standard sort of pictorial photograph would. And then that leads us right back to that question. It's like, well, why? How can we see that? What are we doing? What are we computing in there? Because somewhere in our meatware, there is a computation going on that's telling us something about that is out of shape.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, where it gets really quite fascinating, right? Because that's where colorimetry as sort of like an ideology, if you will, I think falls apart. And I think the biggest problem with colorimetry has always been the labeling of the term color in colorimetry, because it's not color. And the original experiments weren't about color. They were about matching, which is essentially telling you something more about stimulus than it is about color. You put two things together, can you detect division between them? Like, I think in the original Wright-Gill experiments, it was a split square top to bottom, and they would ask the observers to effectively adjust the stimuli until they saw no division. But that's such an impoverished view of what our visual cognition system does, that you think about the heaps of nonsense that have been stacked on top of it since that was ratified in 1931. And I have to remind everybody that it's built on top of actually 1924 research, because the luminous efficacy function became standardized in 1924, and that's the backbone metric of the 1931 standard observer. But none of that speaks to color, which is remarkable, because you have entire educational institutions devoted to color. And I don't know.
Would you say those experiments were almost like simulating what it looks like to zoom in on one pixel, one color, one tiny dot, and make assumptions based on that? I mean, is that a good gross assumption?
I think that's exactly what it was, right? I mean, the actual experiment was essentially a 2-degree, a foveal region, and with a split up to like top to bottom of, and literally just matching two panels. Now, the interesting part about that is that there is an interesting correlation with the spectrum, because they work their way around through the wavelengths to achieve these matches. But again, I think it is so utterly divorced from color that it frightens me that we go and we build on top of it. That demonstration that you showed of your composite, I think, is a remarkably elegant sort of a cuts to the chase of what in many people's minds, in terms of the other side of the research, is what our visual cognition is trying to do, which is this idea of decomposition.
Yeah. Okay, let me just do like a side note here. I think I experienced it, like prior to me reading the Hitchhiker's Guide and prior to me chatting to you. I experienced a problem in that because you've spent time on this, you've have a lot more depth in this. It's almost like you're speaking a language that people don't understand, and it's almost like to discuss these concepts with you, people need acclimatization.
I mean, I do. I don't even you got to remember, I came from the exact, up to about 4 years ago, I was just kind of getting conversant, I guess you could say, with being very comfortable with colorimetric ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I was also growing very disillusioned with them, because what I was being told was not jiving with what I was experiencing. And as a result, I think that's really where I just felt the need to try and find something that was a little bit more meaningful. And, you hit walls where you start to see things and you're convinced that you're seeing something and somebody else is telling you that it's operating in a different way. And it's at some point it becomes an impossible barrier to cross. So thankfully I managed to bumble into the a string of concepts that led me down a whole different rabbit hole. And I like to think that most colorists and photographers and image makers, I think it suddenly speaks their language when you think, when there's this sort of refreshing vantage that is that colorimetry is not nearly, it doesn't work, not nearly in the way that people think it works. And that's sort of liberating, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm very curious as to how, like, what was the path that got you here? Because I mean, from what I've seen your output online, it looks like you definitely understand enough quote unquote color science. I know you don't like the term, but to write code and to obviously dive into the heavy theoretical and academic end of it. But you said you also do on-set work. So can you just give us some broad strokes of like maybe what the touch points are, the things that bounced you to where you are here, like the turning points or whatever, or experiences that you've had that led you to here? Can you maybe like give a bit of a run up before we dive into detail?
Yeah, I graduated high school and went to university and got an art degree, which is about as futile and useless as you can imagine. Not that I regret it, but at some point you have to try and pay the rent.
Right.
But during my art degree, you get exposed to a number of, depending on which branch of art you're studying, and I took an interest in film. And a lot of folks like Robert Richardson, for example, who's a wonderful cinematographer. For folks who don't know,
I looked at that list and it's, I love that.
Yeah, he's a stunning cinematographer, and a lot of folks don't. If you're adjacent to the industry, you usually would know some of the cinematographers who do unique work. But Richardson sort of really cut to the chase of something that I found amazing, which was that he would really, essentially, just push the film medium right to the limits. Like he would just crush the set with lights and use a Fogel rear net and bloom the density right up, like really play with the exposure latitude and control kind of where your visual direction is being steered in the same way that somebody would use focus or use color, and just really incredible sense of aesthetics that would often just essentially shred the medium, and fearless, really, like to have that sort of a will to push the medium to that limit under the duress of a Hollywood production is nothing short of mind-blowing for me.
Yeah, that's what it speaks to me as is that it's fearless. It's got that, no, we're actually going to stomp on it. We're actually going to we're gonna, because lots of his films are war movies and very, very grim subject, and he's kind of saying, okay, the medium is going to go with us into this turmoil. It's going to suffer as well as we're not going safe and keep all the latitude and then decide later in the comfort of the suite. We're actually, in the moment, we're going to push it to the edge, which I think is perfect for his subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch a film like Casino, it's a wonderful exploration of this whole purity dimension, because there's crushing lights all over the casino and you can see these supple, rich colors, but at the same time, when you actually analyze them, if you were to zoom in and pull out a little tiny pixel, you'd find that the vast majority of the frame is often just completely down to the minimum density of the film. There's not a lot of dye there, and it's actually mostly bulb light. So that seems to be a bit of a juxtaposition where I'd be like, how is this even working? Because the point that I return to, which I guess you could say I kind of started with, which was the Star Wars lightsabers, as foolish as that sounds, is why does that work? Which is a perplexing question when you actually look at it and think about it. Because if you go to Amazon and you order a red laser, you get a red laser in the box, you bring it home and you shine it on your wall, and it never turns white. It's tremendously bright, but it never turns white. You get one of the blue lasers, those really high wattage blue lasers that are illegal in a chunk of the world. You shine it against the wall. It's incredibly uncomfortably bright, not to the point where you can experience pain, because obviously there's no nerves in your eyes. but it never turns white. Never, ever turns white. And yet here we are talking about blasters and lightsabers, and they have this white core. So it baffled me from the very, very, very first point where I was examining the medium in an optical printer suite or doing something stupid with scratching the film. And I always wondered why it worked. And I guess that is where you get this entry point. Because if you look at somebody like Matt Mahurin or Robert Richardson or Star Wars, literally any piece of film has this interesting dimension of purity that is not explained anywhere. And that, I guess, is the real tipping point of the entry point of the long journey. Because from that, of course, when I entered into that, everything was more or less analog. I kind of was in the generation where it was transitioning out of analog, and then things became electronic. And of course, having a little bit of an interest in a surrounding around folks who dabbled in 3D and whatnot, I started dabbling with why, essentially pushing the exposure, because again, being a fan of some of this particular photographic styling, you kind of want to push the electronic medium to that, and of course it falls to the absolute crap.
Right.
And that's essentially where you start to have to ask those questions as to, well, why is it falling to crap? What's going on? And that's, I guess, where you'd say that where the rabbit hole kind of started. So that's somewhere around circa 1990, maybe, probably, I don't know. I'm guessing that it starts with music videos and being exposed to music videos in the late mid 80s, when MTV, I guess, came around, and then really hit form in the early 90s, which is where Matt Mahurin hits his stride. And then later on towards, Robert Richardson and some of the other cinematographers who are really, really doing incredible things with the medium.
Yeah, I mean, there was, I was based in South Africa, and obviously the 1994 was when the first democratic elections happened, and there was a massive ramp up in culture, and we were quite remote from what was happening. But yeah, definitely, you could kind of summarize it by one concept, like MTV. What was going on there was kind of what was going on worldwide. Just to, like, you went past it quite quickly, but just for some people who don't understand, is that am I correct in saying that early things like Star Wars, the blaster, the actual what do you call them, the guns, the gunfire, the actual laser bullets that were flying around, and some of the swords were actually physically scribed into the film? Is that correct?
I can speak to the lightsabers themselves because I happen to know somebody who actually works on lightsabers in Empire Strikes Back. And the way that they burn those, they literally burn them in with a thick piece of gel, a colored gel, and essentially burn them into the print itself, or the negative, as it were.
How did it get its glow around it?
Well, that's just it. It essentially is, imagine if you take a very thick piece of gel, say it's like a attenuating towards the longer wavelength, so it's generally cognized as red.
Mm-hmm.
And you blast that into your density. Well, at some point, density of the other layers depletes, and that's where you end up with the projector print bulb versus the dye layer, which is the carrier of the chromatic signal, if you will. So that glow is essentially the part that's not hitting the minimum density,
right.
And the core is the part that's hitting the minimum density of the final print.
And it's actually got some height, so that there may be some actual optical effects going on with the light traveling around this object now sitting on the film. That's very interesting.
Yeah, well, there is a very good series of papers by a fellow by the name of Trumpy, who works with Barbara Flueckiger. I don't know how to pronounce her name entirely. She's a German PhD, and she's had an incredible influence on a huge chunk of really top-tier minds. She's also written an incredible book called Color Mania, which is worth checking out if you have any interest in color film. And filmcolors.org, I think it is her website. But Trumpy has done a bunch of papers on the subject of how to scan film. And one of his interesting papers is on, I think they coined the Callier effect, which is essentially the difference between scanning a piece of emulsion with a diffuse like plate, so pushing a diffused plate against it, versus the actual theatrical approach, which was essentially a collinear projection through the film, because you get different degrees of scattering when you use a diffuser tight to the film. There's a couple interesting papers on that subject. So I guess there are interesting interactions of the way that the light scatters through the film. And that, I think, does have some, I would say that it's not an insignificant contribution to the cognitive effect, because that essentially will create very subtle gradations around what we would otherwise consider a quote unquote sharp edge. And the whole subject of edge is, as slippery a concept as anything, because it's easy for you and I to look and say, oh, there's an edge there. But when you actually figure out that in terms of the optical signal, in terms of the neurophysiological processes, there's no actual threshold of, oh, that's an edge. That's a sort of a computation, if you will, which is kind of mind-blowing unto itself.
By the time it's been projected onto a 2D plane by a lens, yeah.
Yeah, it's essentially that Callier effect that Trumpy talks about is just the difference between a diffusing material, kind of like a telecine. I guess at some point they would use a diffuser telecine versus a projected lamp from behind and then sampling the result. It does have, in his papers, they show some pretty interesting demonstrations. And the majority of their work is in archival, so it's about trying to maintain a degree of the presentation as it, that slippery word authenticity, I guess, is coming into play.
Yeah, I mean, I started out as a facility colorist in the mid-90s, and basically, telecines were expensive, all work came to the facilities that had the telecines, and so it was a bit like a sausage factory. You just did anything. So I did, like, people were doing industrial research with super high speed cameras. I telecined that. Archive stuff, commercials. You just kind of do a wide range of stuff, and kind of, you've got a set of tools, and you get given a thing and say, can you clean this up, or can you? And exactly that thing of you take out all the grain, you smack it with noise reduction because you want to make it new or something. But yeah, I think that would take quite a lot of restraint, actually, to say, no, it should be a bit grubby, it should bounce, it shouldn't be stabilized. Because I found that really interesting. It's something that I didn't think about so much. Is you brought up the point of some kind of metadata to say that the creators of this piece of work wanted to stay in its state, or they're okay for it to be updated with the times. I mean that's a very interesting concept. Could you maybe tell us more about that? I mean, yeah, quote unquote authenticity, but is it a slice of history, or does it constantly update itself as technology updates?
Yeah, I mean, I guess through this whole adventure, you scheme on ways of, like, what would be a protocol that serves the authors of the pictures, because I think we're in this era where the protocols don't serve the authors, and quite frankly, it turns into the sausage making machine, as it were. But worse than that, I think that we've misplaced the notion of where the picture exists, in that a lot of people, and somewhat forgivably, think that when you take a picture out of your camera, that you've taken the picture. And nothing could be further from the truth. You've essentially, in the electrical era, you're taking a very heavily massaged, computed off the board, because of course there's many layers of engineering in there. And you have a quantal catch count that's been either not or essentially transformed, to quote, I think Dr. Poynton uses the term, the colorimetric formation matrix, which is a wonderful term because it implies that, in fact, the colorimetry is formed through that matrix. Mm-hmm. And those what now is colorimetric, essentially wattages, if you will, or relative wattages, people think that that's the picture, and it's not. Essentially, it's a gain dimension only off of the sensor. And the real magic of the picture, in terms of the film era, was that very interesting interaction with density, which has some interesting mathematical implication. But I think that because people think that quote unquote raw, or any other of the terms that you want to use at the time, that they believe that that's the picture, which is not the case. And then we introduce the Georgianian Kodak term of the scene versus the display. And again, we have another kind of an impoverished view of what a picture is. This idea is that we want to just convey the stimuli from the scene. And interestingly, Kodak knew that that was not the case. They knew that all the way back to at least 1951, when McAdam essentially, David McAdam, who's a famous researcher at Kodak during the time, and has written many, many papers, is probably one of the more cited people out of Kodak's research pile, and Kodak paid a lot of people to do a lot of research. In fact, the majority of the colorimetric research is essentially funded by Kodak. But McAdam knew that a picture's not that. In fact, that within the limits of their ability at the time, they were able to measure, say, for example, because it was directed at a Caucasian skin, and when presented, the Caucasian skin was presented as accurately as possible. The majority of the, I guess you could call them judge eyes, the folks who were judging the pictures, found it undesirable, which is a really fascinating concept that is sort of also logical, that in that when we're looking at a picture, we're not looking at a scene. We're not doing an A to B comparison. We're actually relying on memory encodings when we're looking at a picture.
Is that more like what it felt like? Like what it felt like rather than a strict measurement of what it is or was? Or
yeah, it absolutely is. It absolutely is what it felt like, because if you think about it, you're looking at a picture, you have no reference to what, we look at a picture and we go, oh, it's a dog. Well, we're pretty forgiving for dogs because it's not really our species, et cetera, et cetera. But we do know what a dog looks like. We kind of know what like the colors of something are. But when you look at a picture of a banana, for example, what does that even mean? You look at 100 bananas, you have many, 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 many different experiences of the stimuli of the banana. This starts as distal stimuli. That's the energy, the stimuli that's away from your organs, away from your body, lands the proximal stimuli on your retina. But if you think about that actual stimuli, it's incredibly, incredibly variegated. So why is it when you look at a picture of a banana that you say, oh, the banana is yellow? Because it's not yellow. In fact, it's very rarely yellow. So you're essentially relying on these memory encodings, not only of the color, the textural quality of the banana, but also the general form of a banana. And it's quite well known that we kind of do a hunting when we're looking at things. So if you're looking at a picture and you go, oh, I think that's an eye, you will suddenly start hunting for another eye, and oh, that's a face. And then you assemble this sort of interesting puzzle, if you will. So it's not just this classic passive absorption of stimuli, but this really highly active, highly aggressive, in some cases, winner take all.
Yeah, need-based kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interaction. Like you can imagine if you have a few wines and you're at a party and you're at your friend's house and they have those lovely curtain wall patio doors. At some point, you may walk into the patio door because your cognition, your inference of what was there was wrong. So in many ways, survival depends on this interesting, I'm going to make an analysis of what I think I'm seeing, and I'm going to make a decision based upon that. And that's kind of, in essence, what we're looking at when we look at pictures. And in the electrical era, we know that there's an endless barrage of pictures that are broken, but it's not a conveyance of stimuli, to get back to the original point. And like I said, Kodak knew this, McAdam knew this, and Bartelson in 1960, 1960s and 1970s actually did a series of papers on the influence of memory colors. But even then, it's kind of an impoverished lens, because when we think about a memory color, we're saying a banana is yellow, and no banana is yellow, because a banana is this incredibly variegated, collage of stimuli at any given moment that we look at a banana, and it can just change in front of us as we turn it.
Yeah, what it says to me is it's almost like the analogy of language. We need these things called words or concepts that we do gross summarization of what we experience out there in the world. It's our sense-making process to say, okay, hot, cold, light, dark, all these gross terms, and that kind of speaks something. Also, you spoke, kind of made a lot of sense to me that a picture as text. So it's a conveyance medium. It's encoded, decoded by our brains. But yeah, I think this, for me specifically, this is going to take a long time to actually make sense of, that the image is not actually in those bits of data that are passing around our color correction system. It's an analogy, it's a summary, it's a paragraph describing what was going on the day, but it's not actually what was going on the day in those terms that you mentioned, that we love to throw around now, scene referred light. So is that the problem with things like modern day color management and modern day approaches, is to say that we'd love to have a nicely packaged, quote unquote, scientific summary of what's going on to make our jobs easier? I mean, do you see that as an issue that we just want? Just give me the answer. Don't confuse me. Just give me a simple answer. Is that the underlying problematic assumption?
I think it's a pretty interesting question. I'm actually a bit of a herp derp on this subject, in that, again, returning back to the idea of film and density and the Richardson and the Mahurans of the world, when we look at a picture and we engage our lowest order cognition, we start to piecemeal forms. And this is where essentially where the electrical era, I would say, takes a sidestep, in that, like, for example, right now I'm looking at your computer screen, except I'm looking at your computer screen, I'm looking at a picture of you.
Yeah.
But your computer screen has this very interesting thing on it in the upper left, which is this giant quote unquote sheen. And
oh yeah, I see it there. Yeah.
It's really easy for me to say, oh, there's a sheen there. But when we actually think about what you're doing right now, it's an incredibly complex phenomena that's going on, because I am now able to say that's a sheen on your screen, but why is it not part of the screen's texture, if you will? How am I able to glance at that picture and realize that in fact there's a sheen on top of something else?
Right.
And that is the incredible tricky part, because when we look at this sort of thing through the lens of a pictorial exposure or film, we can see, for example, the top of your screen there has the sprocket holes, and I am somehow cognizing a continuous color across your screen, across those sprocket holes. And yet, if we were to sample every pixel out of there, we're not going to find a single pixel sample when pulled out in isolation that would even remotely be congruent with the color that I think I'm seeing. So I've just taken something that I thought was a passive absorption of stimuli, and I'm actually even going a step further. I'm not even thinking about the fact that I can identify the color there. But when we actually break it down and we analyze it, we realize that the color that we thought we saw, the color that we thought was passively in the scene, is not even there. So that particular thing, that sheen, is in fact what I'd say probably 3 decades worth of chasing dead ends has essentially culminated in.
I mean, have a look here. So I've put a little circular window in the other corner, and now I'm moving that color around now. So this is actually inside the image. Now, you know, I mean, this is also like some kind of brightening that's going on. I could, if I could see my image at the same time, I could maybe match the two. But yeah, I mean, this is what becomes really interesting. So you inside the actual image versus inside the space, light bouncing off the monitor. So there's so many layers to this whole
100%
interaction of light.
Yeah, and that's in essence, like, there is no generalized agreement on any of this, as far as I have come to know. In fact, one of Gilchrest's books that he edited is incredible. He's like assembled like 5 of these really amazing thinkers on lightness, brightness, transparency, darkness. And at the very beginning, he says, it became clear to me that nobody was agreeing on anything, even though we kind of agreed on the general ideas behind, which I think is a wonderful change from this position of authority. You know, you have somebody who spent an entire lifetime researching lightness, and is the first guy who, like, you can go to YouTube and watch some of his presentations, and he just says, like, I don't know. He asks what's going on, which is, there's a certain humility in just saying we don't know what the hell's going on, that was so refreshing. And I found that, in contrast to the colorimetric worldview, that everybody that I've seen, generally speaking, around the, I guess what you'd call the computational neuroscience or the visual neurocognition side, there's a lot of ideas, but even somebody like Livingstone seems to communicate that she's not sure, like that these ideas are not fleshed out. Nothing's resolved. We have some general ideas. We know how certain things sort of work, but we're still kind of in the dark ages of this visual cognition and how we process this. And specifically with pictures, this one in particular, that Sheen is in essence, I guess what I could say is that if you and I were to sit in a print lab and we were to shoot this, and let's pretend for a moment that bulb that's, I'm guessing, is somewhere else, is not present in the room, we could take the negative, and if we put a fuzzy snoot on a light and we projected it onto the negative, we could actually, and then we carefully mat it so that it's not hitting the top of that monitor area there, we could create the exact same effect that, for all intents and purposes, somebody looking at our picture wouldn't be able to tell the difference of. And that's really interesting to me, because that is essentially the essence of what film-like pictorial exposure was. And we can kind of see where these ideas, I guess you could say, arrive at a nexus point. Whereas if you chase around any of the scene versus display discussions, you'll hear all this nonsense about cone bleaching or something else, even though that particular effect is so fundamental, so critical, and absolutely so foundational in our pictorial depictions that we take it for granted. And I think we probably take it for granted because we aren't even aware that it's happening. It's almost like asking somebody to see their blind spot.
Can you explain that concept, cone bleaching?
The gist of it is that there's a pump that is essentially replenishing the absorptive material in the cones. And the cones, and I even hate talking about the cones because so much of the online, somebody forwarded me a video of this, yet another video on color. And of course, they show this cross section of the retina, and then they highlight the cones. And there's literally these other blobs in the picture. And they go, okay, well, here's the cones, here's the absorptive profiles, voila, color, magic. And it's so funny because it's like, well, what comes after those cones? Because what people don't realize is that the cones aren't hooked up to a little numerical readout. In fact, the cones, there is no measurement in the human retina, none. It does not. For example, the book Colorimetry, Fundamentals and Applications, I think it's called. Page 4, there's a diagram of the retina and then a diagram of a camera. And they equate how the retina is like a camera. And it's the most prevalent myth that it suffocates our thinking. In fact, Gilchrest, again, in the 1980s, he came up with the term the photometer myth, which is the idea that the eye acts as this measuring device. And of course, who better than to be somebody who studied lightness for their entire life to say that that's a myth? Because we have this general idea, energy goes up, it's got to be brighter. And that's just not the case. And it's such a almost unconscious computation that we think that's the case. But it's just not the case at all. And in fact, those cones are routed to bipolar cells, essentially, after they pass through our macron cells. So the bipolar cells are a differential, which is, instead, if you imagine that there's a quantity at A and a quantity at B, in a camera sensor, we'd say quantity A is 10 units, quantity B is 5 units. But the bipolar cells take that signal and they do not report A and B. They report C, which is A minus B. Right. Which is something completely different. It's a gradient signal. It's a differential signal. It's not, there is no measurement, plus or minus what Barlow says about maybe 1% of the cells that can have some general idea of mean energy. So the cone bleaching is that you can actually figure this out real quick. If you look at a diagram of the retina, you'll see that the retina, the light enters in through the lens, and the first thing it passes through is essentially all of the optic nerve fibers that are routed out to the optic nerve itself. And then it passes through the ganglion cells, and then it passes through the bipolar cells, and then it passes through the cone cells. So the cone cells are the last thing in the energy chain.
I find that amazing. Just it's literally like it was built upside down.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason I'm going about this long-winded answer is that when you think about what this bleaching is, the bottom line is that if we fixate, we lose all sense of vision. And this has been proven, I believe it was Ditchburn. There's several researchers in the 50s. There's a Russian fellow, Yarbus was another one in the 60s. They did these elaborate, incredible pieces of research, and Yarbus has involved these little micro toilet plungers, basically, that were stuck to the cornea. And they fixated they stabilized the image in very unique ways. And of course, what happens when the image is stabilized is that you lose your vision. It doesn't turn white, it doesn't turn black. You just get this very peculiar sort of a null signal. If you look up online, you can Google for things known as Troxler effect, which there's a blurry patterns out there where if you stare at the cross, your vision will just tune it out to this very peculiar null. It's not like white like a lightsaber. It's this very peculiar mush that you sort of experience. So that is essentially what cone bleaching is. And it is completely unrelated to what I would say is the role of pictorial exposure in a picture. In the sense that we also know this because, of course, in order for that to happen, you have to actually fixate. And that doesn't really happen when Darth is dueling with Obi-Wan, they're moving around. And we're still able to cognize this peculiar white part is like, you ask a 9-year-old what color is Darth Vader's lightsaber, he's going to say it's red. That's amazing because it's on a stimuli level, it's not red. And as I showed you in that other demo, if you actually take any picture online of Darth versus Luke or Darth versus Obi-Wan and you sample the pixels, you won't actually find any sample of stimuli that is the color you thought you saw. And you can actually do this on any picture. You will very, very, very rarely, there are some exceptionally rare times where you might be able to find a pixel that roughly satisfactorily corresponds with what you think you're seeing. But for the vast majority of the time, I'm going to say 99.9%, you're never going to do it. It's just does not happen in terms of like standard pictures we're talking, not like samples of a swatch or something like that.
So there's some process that our sweetening. There's some like extra meaning that our brain is adding onto what we see, so that it really isn't just the sum of its parts. It's not totally disassemblable. There's a kind of a like an Instagram filter or something, of meaning of like, oh, okay, this is what's important. There's a discernment that's going on above rather than the thing. I just want to hammer it home one more time that the key distinction you're making here and that you're citing these references is that eye is not a camera. It's not just a portal out to the world for our brains to see. It's not just a measurer of light. It is a sensor of light, sure. It responds to light in the visible spectrum, but not measuring absolute values, much more about differentials and differences. And obviously that's got some evolutionary benefit that we need to see when things move. We need to see distance, near, far, all those things. I mean, it's way above both our pay grades to get into the full details of neuroscience. But I mean, with that as a kind of a basis, day to day, as colorists, as photographers, film professionals, we are now faced with, we've been handed a set of tools. Things like Resolve color management, ACES system, whatever goes on in Nucoda, Baselight, and all these systems. And we assume that they're based on white papers, and we kind of assume that it's the truth. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of discussion, and people are doing amazing coding. Like yourself, you wrote the AGX thing. Jed Smith, OpenDRT, Juan's got his 2499. These are amazing alternatives as to way to manage your color. What would you say to people who are saying, but I mean, this is good enough, or this is the bulk standard? This must be true. It's based on science, kind of thing. And like, surely we can't just throw everything out and say, okay, we've got to start from scratch. So, I mean, can you maybe give some strategies to dealing with, what we have as bulk standard color management, some options that are appearing on the scene, and what you see as maybe the problems and the way forward?
I think that the essence of what you're saying is that we're saying color management, and we're falling into essentially the same pitfall that we have as we started with, which is, what are we doing? And one vantage is that our goal is to put a camera up and record the thing in front of the camera and then convey it to the observer. And I do not believe that is at all, since the history of the photographic medium, that's never been the case. And film prints, for example, deviate along that exact line. Like not only was Kodak doing some interesting stuff in tuning the Caucasian skin and the response and everything else, but if I ask you simply as a colorist, like you and I go out and we wanted to shoot something and we want to have a dreamy feel, so we quote unquote overexpose our shot by say 4 stops, and we get back this thing on film that looks beautiful. So there's barely any density there, maybe, and then you color that, maybe you put a tint on it or something. I don't know. That out of camera exposed picture that we look at, that's virtually impossible to experience in any other form because essentially there's no density there. And good luck trying to generate that in standard ecological perception. Like that is one of the most challenging things that you could possibly do. Or when the spaceship beam passes overhead and it crushes down onto the face, and the person puts their arm up and tries to block the light from the sky, and it blows out basically the entire frame. There's barely any density there. That also never happens. It just does not happen. And I think it cuts to the chase of the matter is that I reject outright that we are color managing anything. Not only are we not color managing it, because we're just not, because color is a cognitive computation as best as I can tell, but we're also, the essence of what we do is not color. We're not managing color. That's an impoverished lens of the entire process. We're actually making pictures, and pictures are human artifacts, and human artifacts are consumed and read by other humans. There's a famous philosopher who has a son in the film industry who's quite a well-known cinematographer. The philosopher's name is Stuart Hall, and he has an encoding-decoding conjecture, which is a wonderful read, kind of segues into information theory. Well worth a read for anybody out there. It essentially talks about how a human encodes something and then another human decodes it or imbues that with meaning. And in many ways, that's kind of what a picture is. If I hand you a picture, I'm hoping that you can decode it, but how you go about decoding it is a really, again, the tricky proposition that we're talking about here. Like, again, look at the sheen on your screen. How do we decode that is a screen underneath a sheen? And that's kind of the essence of the discussion. So pictorial exposure and the nature of those operations in the gradient domain, that is where I think we go off the rails, because we're not managing color. We know, Kodak again knew, we're not trying to capture the energy as present in front of the camera. And this whole idea, like it's so ever present. It's just become a parroted a priori assumption that is in fact what we're doing. And yet the vast majority of evidence, for anybody who's willing to look at a picture, simply rejects that outright. Just look at the picture. What you look at in a picture is not a conveyance of the stimuli. You won't find a single pixel coming out of an Arri Alexa that is even close to the stimuli that was in front of that camera. And in fact, when you put a clapper in front of the camera and you photograph that clapper, look at the colors of the red time code. It's not the same red. Sometimes in a dark room, it might turn white, or it might turn like a weird magenta if you're dealing with the early Alexa versus the 35 version. My point is, though, is that these things are all around us all the time, and we just make these assumptions, and they're just flatly not true. I don't know if I answered your question as fully as possible, but
yeah. I mean, it somehow just speaks to it's what we've been as the artist, it's what we've been handed, and we will, we'll create with what we've been given. And I think that's people might hear what you're saying and get a bit disheartened. Because but I think underlying to what you're saying is it's not, you don't have to throw out the process. It's more just, well, I don't know which direction, because there's so many directions we could go in, but maybe the one direction to go in is this idea of progress. Maybe that leads off what you were saying now. Like, okay, it has to, 4K is not good enough. We need 8K. Yeah. We need wide gamut. We need, it said, this to infinity and beyond kind of vibe, which is, it's good old capitalism at work, et cetera. But does it help us to make better images? And just to give you a context point, I've graded a fair amount of HDR demo videos that are literally only going to get shown on one monitor in a showroom, and literally they don't give a toss about accurate. They just wanted to fill the whole 2020
Yeah.
color space.
they want that thing to stand out when like a moth being drawn to a flame as they're walking through the showroom floor.
Right.
And I think that's essentially what, this nonsense. I mean, we've known the loudness wars forever. We've known that the big box shops jack the brightness. Like, we know this stuff, and it's because it's essentially nonsense. But it, I guess, attracts people to go look at the thing or something. But in the end, I think what I guess, if you think about you as a colorist, how much of your work is spent fixing stuff, I think that's essentially what it comes down to, is that, like, I'm a huge believer in ergonomics, and there was a certain liberating thing where you could take a camera, you could load it with film, and you could go, and assuming that you kind of get the exposure kind of where you got something denting it, you don't get handed like some reversal stock in your entire 400-foot rolls or 200-foot rolls or like black.
Right.
There's something liberating about being able to just shoot and not think about, like, oh, am I clipping, or I'm like, all of these things are essentially modern era baggage. And you think about, well, why are people worried about clipping? Because the bottom line is that, for example, slide film, very limited range of energy that you could pound into slide film, but you could create beautiful images. Those images are clipped. It's only seeing a small window of the energy that was in front of the camera. But if you were a decent craftsperson, you could generate incredible pictures. So it can't be about clipping. Like, that just can't be the case. So what is it? It's something else. It's essentially about, I prefer to think of it as the way that you approach the limits of the medium are absolutely critical. So it's not necessarily the quote-unquote dynamic range. That just defers the problem. In the modern era, everybody's obsessed with these dynamic range things. But in the end, if you have an infinite dynamic range, your picture is effectively mush. The crux of it is that the way that we taper from the lowest end of the display medium to the upper end of the display medium, or the canvas, if you will, is really what matters. Like, clipping, what people don't like is this sort of interesting ascent, and then everything starts falling apart, and then it really falls apart. That is essentially where my interest rests, is like, why are we saying that falls apart? Why does that not look good? What's going wrong there? And I think it is implicitly tied to, again, I don't think there's any way out of this puzzle, out of this maze, without turning our brains away from this colorimetric worldview and towards cognition. Like, how are we parsing this picture? Why am I seeing this? Why is that nightclub red light? Why does it look so bad? You can ask 100 or 1,000 incredibly experienced people who spend their entire day behind consoles, and I bet you will not get an answer. I bet you'll get all sorts of interesting things like, oh, it's clipping, but none of those explain why cognitively that's a disruptive portion of the picture frame. And that's, I think, where we need to think, because that's the only way out of this essential reverberating trap of endless echo that does, we just keep circling around these terms like, oh, it's gamut mapping. Like, what does that even mean? Yes, there's entire books written on gamut mapping, and I swear to you, you read them and there's no information in there. It turns into an exercise in shoveling numbers around some diagram that doesn't mean anything. The implications of what we do to those stimuli have a huge impact on the cognitive level, not on the numerical level.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Just to highlight the point there, I think that the limits of the medium are what define it. So this concept of, constantly spiraling upwards resolution and constantly spiraling upwards dynamic range, is that really giving us a better result? I mean, I think we need to think really hard about that. I mean, just where you see where the mid-gray point on log C4 and log C3 are, is all that extra headroom actually helping you to form your image?
Well, I bring this point up a lot. Like, as a colorist, how many times have you people talk, like, let's just 17 log 2 units or whatever it is. Like, I hate to tell you, but measure how many code values those are getting jammed into, because you might be shocked. People talk about, oh, this dynamic range is dynamic. It's like, okay, let's just say we're watching this on an iPad or whatever, which is, plus or minus 8 bits. You got 255 possible emission steps. where are all those numbers going?
Right.
I have some bad news for you. I mean, it's funny because, black and white film, everybody talked about, say you got like 16 log 2 energy units, but the meat and potatoes of the image is somewhere around 6 of those log 2 units.
Right.
If you evaluate it in terms of like density, it's not, the rest is this tapered off and jammed into very few incremental steps. Now, of course, that was an analog medium, but in terms of like an electronic medium, you got 255 increments. That's the majority of all of the work. Everybody's looking at these 255 increments across 3 channels. So how many of those, what's the actual number of code values that these stops are getting jammed into that everybody's waxing lyrical about? You might be lucky if it's about 10 at the high end and 10 at the bottom end.
Right.
It's just not important. What is important is how we're getting there. That's essentially, and that should be totally unsurprising when we started this discussion with the key point, which is the signal is increment and decrement. The signal is a gradient domain, aka a slope measurement, in the increment and decrement direction. So those gradients, in the math sense, translate to an incredible superimportance of gradations in the artistic sense, if you will. The rate of change of a gradation in the artistic sense, that's essentially the language of that optic signal. Like everything that we see, everything that we cognize, everything that we project out into the world, like I think I see a fox behind a cloud by a tree, that's essentially an inference that's emerging out of that gradient, increment, and decrement signal. That's why it's such an incredibly powerful and incredibly useful lens to just start thinking about color cognition from. And people do get frustrated, I think, when they initially hear, oh, it's all wrong. It's like, no, we really have to think. Color imagery can be wrong, and it can be frustrating to say, oh, it's wrong, in the sense that it's not actually working to deliver us better pictures because we're not addressing it on even the beginning at the right entry point. But it's really a liberating force for us to start thinking about how we think, like how we think about those pictures. How do we peel apart a picture into, how do I know that's a sheen on your monitor there? That's the $1 million question. And that might seem silly, but there's a vast, interesting overlap between that sheen and how we peel apart pictures and decompose them into forms.
Yeah, I think that's the part that people need, first listening to the ideas that you're talking about, that's the part that people are just, well, that's all assumed. And then I think it's often, they'll revert back to very like, well, I noticed that I did a lot. It's just like, oh, but, it's some, you say it's some control value in the way that I graded it, or it's because I used this color management. And you always default back to some technical underlying process terms. But you're actually looking at the end result and then into the wetware, into the biology. You're kind of focusing on that end of things. So it's a long chain of events, and it's hard to know. We just focus in on one level. I've got a knob marked gain, and that's the only one that I can control the signal with. So that's where I feel like I've got my agency. But you're taking the whole process. So I think that's what's going to be very hard for people. Obviously, I'd highly recommend that people read your Hitchhiker's Guide to get acclimatized.
I'm going to be a little bit simpler. Like, honestly, I think all we need to do is look at the picture, because we don't have the agency to know what gain knob is. We don't know what the math is. You just look at the stimulus presented in front of you and just simply say, okay, well, why am I finding this weird? Why is this broken? Why is that red light feel, what's it doing? It doesn't, that peculiarity, that simplicity of just looking at the picture and evaluating what you think you're seeing is kind of where all these, where the questions start. I mean, the answers, as I said, they can only be answered in my mind by kind of going in the opposite direction, which is to just think about how we think about pictures. But it starts at a really simple entry point, And the exposure one's a classic one. You ask 100 colorists, how do you increase or decrease exposure? I just asked this the other day of a colorist, and they were like, well, you take the scene referred signal, if you will, or the open domain colorimetry wattage, and you apply a multiplication. And then, everybody knows this. You ask 100 colorists, I'm almost certain that 100 colorists will tell you, and then they'll say, what are you getting at? This is a dumb discussion. What's going? And then you say, okay, great. If you increase the exposure by 4 stops, 4 log 2 units, What do you expect to see on your monitor? And they were like, well, I expect it to kind of start going, I guess, white. And then you say, okay, well, that's great, but that's not gain. It's just not gain. When you think about what a gain is, you're essentially taking the three signals and we're literally multiplying them in unison if we're applying an unbiased gain.
Yeah.
And we're scaling them upwards. So essentially we're making the red laser brighter. Or in the poor term, because Gilchrest is probably rolling over and crying somewhere in the world, but we're increasing the emission intensity of the red laser. That's all we're doing by gaining. That's not going white. And again, interestingly, that never happens in standard ecological cognition. And these obvious sort of things are only obvious when you're so foolish as to actually think about what's going on. Something's going white. Where is that happening? So you're operating on your resolve console and you're twisting that gain knob and you twist it far enough and you get a white screen. Where's that happening? And people are, well, it's clipping. Well, that doesn't actually mean something, because what we don't expect it to just suddenly, like, you don't turn the knob and suddenly everything, the screen goes white. You actually kind of expect it to attenuate in the colorimetric purity dimension slowly as you turn that knob, right?
Right.
But that's not gain. That is not gain. That's not a multiplication of the signal. And yet that is such a crucial part of the work in picture making. You ask, again, 100 cinematographers ask 100 colorists, they'll all say it's gain. And you're absolutely right. That is that is exposure at one stage of the process, but it's not the stage that we're looking at. Something else is doing that. Something else is creating that stimuli that you're seeing, and it's not the gain knob.
Well, okay, just to play devil's advocate for the manufacturers, to say that, okay, we're heading towards better and better displays. What if one day out of the production line pops a monitor that can display all the colors in the 1931 CIA diagram? Isn't the problem solved then? If it can go up to, like, I don't know, 20,000 nits and the gamut is just amazing, doesn't that solve your problem? That now there's infinite range to get brighter without hitting the boundary where R, G, and B all limit.
Well, if anybody's ever looked at like a Robert Richardson or a Matt Maheron picture, are they good-looking pictures? Because it seems to me that having that playground delineated, demarcated. And if you look at a Caravaggio picture, that's a painting there, and it's gone, oh, that's a really nice-looking painting. Or a painting that the artist has done watercolor work. The limit of that medium is what defines that, the nature of that expression, if you will. And I would say that I absolutely don't want, like, it would be a little bit like having a camera that you can't turn off auto exposure on. It seems to be a bit of a trick if you keep jacking up the emission intensity and you never hit a wall. Well, if you're trying to do the space alien spaceship over top in the way that is almost a trope now, how do you do that? Doesn't happen because you don't have that limit.
Let me push one step further. Let's say that the display gets so, quote unquote, good, bright, wide gamut, such that it feels like standing there under the spaceship. Then all we're doing is we're saying, me actually looking at a real spaceship would feel super bright and the wind blowing and everything. But now me standing in front of this $1 million monitor feels equivalently bright, and hence my biology will react in a similar way. I'm intentionally being the reductionist.
Absolutely. And I would just say that all we have to do is travel back 80 years and read that David McAdam book paper again, where he says that, again, as measured, was not desirable. So there's clearly something else going on. There's clearly memory encodings play a very, very, very important role here, or something else. I mean, I think that there's a lot of layers, and to suggest that it's like simply a memory encoding, I think is foolish. This one passage is worth listening to think on. It's the range of face colors in the portraits was entirely separate from the range of natural face colors. And the separation of the centers of those ranges is approximately the same as indicated in figure 11. This is the final passage. Therefore, it seems not only chaotic, but fallacious that to assume exact reproduction to be the norm or to measure degradations from that basis. So even in 1951, like I said, McAdam was onto something here. He clearly noticed that the research was leaning towards something that was different. Another wonderful passage, which I personally love because it includes one of my favorite terms that McAdam uses. He says, two conclusions are indicated by the diagram in figure 11. First, optimum reproduction of skin color is not exact reproduction. The print represented by the point closest to the square, exact reproduction, in scare quotes, is rejected almost unanimously as beefy. On the other hand, when the print of the highest acceptance is masked and compared with the original subject, it seems quite pale.
Beefy, I love that.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
beefy is like, but it's something to think about. And again, the interesting part there is that we says when he masks it, that it seems quite pale. Well, that's exactly what we do when we sample the stimuli of a picture and pull it out and extract it, and we go, well, wait a minute, that's not the color. So he's essentially, there's a number of things going on there. One of them could be the decomposition of the skin in the context of the picture, the Caucasian skin, because again, that was really all that anybody cared about. The other one could be that there's something else going on in terms of the decomposition, striations of decomposition, like maybe as we decompose the layers, as I cognitively am computing out that diffuse sheen on your monitor, there could be other mechanisms at work there. But the bottom line is that those mental games are interesting. They're just, I don't think that I think we already have enough evidence on the table to suggest that there's more to it than thinking about the future. We can't even sort out the present. And until we can sort out the present, maybe we are we're relying on something to become apparent, where I think we already have enough evidence to show that, like right now, any colorist or any person at home can take a tuned piece of colorimetric data and present it on their display, within reason, very closely to the stimulus measurements. If we were to pull it out, spectro, and then convert it to colorimetry. And there are things that look very peculiar. You can do that right now. You can actually experience David McAdam's beefiness right now. And in fact, there are forums all over the net where if you compare somebody who's taken a chromaticity linear attenuation path in their picture formation, that it looks weird. They don't even know it. They don't know why, but they'll be like, nobody wants salmon skin is a pretty often termed. And it's a very peculiar thing. It's something I think buried under these stacks of layers of interesting things that we're not really looking at, that we probably should. But I don't know. The infinite HDR display is not appealing to me at all. Not to mention that gain regulation has a say in all of this. And there's a reason that we can walk outside lit underneath a nuclear fission ball and still navigate the world. And it's just not like, it's not
painful.
It's not this infinite. Yeah, exactly. Even looking at the sun is not painful, which is part of the problem. But we do have that gain regulation, and I think that people grossly have been led to think that gain regulation is not a thing, and that somehow we actually can measure nits. But again, returning to the original statement, we have no measurement cells. It's all differential gradients, and it's all dynamically regulated.
So maybe in summary, we're saying that the scientific reductionist approach is not the solution to all color picture-related storytelling problems. Humans are, there's layers to this of social inference, desirable and undesirable, that also goes into our cognition. You've also spoken about the structure of the eye being it's not designed as a photometer. It's what we're seeing there biologically is doesn't back that theory up either.
If I can do one thing, it's to draw people's attention to their own experience, because I think we have a certain, under the late era Kodak worldview, there is so much of our visual cognition that is absolutely fascinating, that a lot of people aren't even aware of, because they're sort of buying into these systems that literally don't work. They're mythical structures that exist for a bunch of reasons that aren't necessarily serving the authors, the image authors, and aren't doing them justice to what they're trying to do. And I don't know how to get out of that without at least trying to, raise the watermark, raise the tide a little bit on the general understanding of these sorts of ideas.
Yeah, my current feeling is that the solution isn't some better gear or some better tools or some better. That's not the solution. It's more just to realize the amazement and wonder of the process and kind of dwell in that state of amazement and just observe it in different ways with the tools that you have, rather than saying, I need a solution, give me better tools or that kind of thing. I don't think that from the little bit that I know about life in general, it's going to keep moving. It's a moving target, and it's not, as soon as you bottle it down and write it up as rules, it dies. And it's not the thing. The thing is already left and become something else already the moment you put pen to paper. So I think it's more about dwelling in that observational state, that live state.
I can show you a number of examples that I think will make things a little bit more clear with respect to the way that we go about decomposing the things that are presented in front of us. Like, this is a very interesting subject that's mechanistic. And in fact, while we may not be able to say unequivocally how it works, we can certainly rule out a lot of things, the way that they don't work, but we can even more interestingly spot patterns that help us in authoring pictures. It gives a lot of folks a path of agency, and that they can suddenly, once you can put a label on something, once you're able to realize what it is that's actually causing a certain cognitive hiccup, the operation to fix it becomes almost self-evident, and you wonder why you didn't see it in the first place. But these things are it's really, really, really challenging to put into words what we're seeing. And that's kind of where the fruit comes out of the discussion and the rabbit hole, I guess is what I'd say.
Okay, cool.
I can probably pull out some examples and give you like something that we can talk about in terms of the pictorial exposure and that whole, I find that subject specifically, like where is that exposure coming from, is the one that we can probably focus on to give people actionable things to think about. And at the core of AGX and whatnot, those sorts of explorations, these are central. They're very, very much at the core of the whole lightsaber / Richardson exposure thing.
Great.
There is essentially, there's three core concepts, which is the increment-decrement signal, the idea of gain regulation, and the idea of field propagation. So those three things I would say are the visual mechanics that are always on, always at work. And then from that, I would say that we can take that into like an order of operations of what sort of is in a volley as we look at a certain thing and we're making a diagnosis. There's form decomposition, form computation, and then form assignment. Like that's where we assign the color to the forms that we've decomposed. And I have some examples to sort of hopefully make that a little bit more clear. That point about the sheen is actually really interesting. If you put a sheen over top of a colored swatch, watch as you adjust the sheen, how the color will break through or won't break through. Because that is, in essence, that's exactly pictorial exposure, albeit, if you think about a sphere and you look at a sphere, it's got a sheen on it, and it's got a shadow on it, and it's got all this other interaction of all this other energy, but somehow you can look at the ball and say, oh, it's red. Somehow we are fissioning out those levels, and yet when you look at a picture, you put that sheen over top of the red patch on your monitor. If that red patch is too colorimetrically pure, as in the floor is too low, on the red patch only, which is like so common it's disturbing, your cognition will trigger on that instantly. You'll suddenly decompose that swatch as being either on top or through, like a hole. And that's where the power of the whole decomposition, the mindset of decomposition is so powerful, is that you now can essentially tell a person who's trying to learn colors that you're now changing the cognitive decomposition by pushing too much purity into that red patch. It's no longer underneath the haze. It's no longer underneath the sheen. It's now either a sticker on top or it's a hole through it.
Yeah, there's some unnecessary, mistaken distortion that's happened.
Well, think about this. Like, if you imagine a black hole, like Vanta Black, a sheet of like absolute 100% energy absorbing material. And now imagine that we take that energy absorbing material and we put it underneath a sheet of glass or a display. And now we have, say, a reflection of the wall on it. The question that I would have to you is that most people, when they say black, they think 0, 0, 0 in RGB. But if I take that absolute black hole black and I put it underneath the sheet of glass, and there's a general energy that's bouncing off the glass and entering into my visual cognition path. Is the black 0, 0, 0? And the answer is, of course it's not.
Yeah.
We've added energy to it. And that's the pictorial, when you think about pictorial exposure, you think about aces, then why it's such a horrible bad shit. As you turn the exposure up, you get these things that are punching holes in your picture. And that's literally what's happening cognitively, right? Because we're decomposing now. It's crossing a gradient threshold where the gradient now is too steep. And we're saying this is no longer under the sheen. It's no longer under the pictorial exposure. We're now cognizing it as a sticker on top or a hole through it. And it's the same mechanic over and over and over again. That's why I brought up the sheen. That simple little observation is so profound with regard to how we decompose pictures.
Great. No, every time I hear you explain it, it kind of gets slightly clearer to me. So this is excellent. I'm really enjoying the journey.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. It sounds like it's space cadet philosophy at some level, but at some level, I return to the idea that it's actually once I was like exposed to the idea of decomposition, I was like, oh my God, this is like the best breath of fresh air ever, because it's the first time I felt that I could explain what I was seeing, which is saying something. Because, you can spend a long time and not be able to explain something. But then suddenly you say, oh, well, the blue swatch is now, we're decomposing it wrong. It's now living like a sticker. We've got to reduce the pure, because everybody, and especially in your job, everybody wants, make it more saturated. And it's like, actually, you're just totally destroying the saturation, the cognitive experience saturation by jacking it. And in fact, you're breaking the picture. There's a lot of crazy demonstrations that I've seen that I think some of them are so profoundly world changing that it's like, it just helps to solidify this idea that color is a computation assignment inside of our meatware and not outside of us. And I think if we can hammer that point home, it'll change the way that people think about, like, just the way they think. It's really kind of a rewarding, when you can viscerally experience it. It's something else.
Troy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
To be continued. It's very, very inspiring, and thanks a lot. Chat soon.
All right, can't wait to chat with you again there, Paul. Be well, sir. We'll talk soon.
Cool. Cheers, Troy. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for listening to the Color Mentor podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can leave comments on Patreon or Instagram. The Instagram handle is color.mentor. And remember to head over to the Color Mentor page on patreon.com and check out the goodies there. We'll see you next time.